Under normal circumstances specifically, the bi-weekly Sunday visits officially authorized by King Charles III, Queen Camilla's extended family is granted access to the royal private quarters. For years, this twice-monthly arrangement represented a hard-won victory for the Queen, a carefully calculated administrative exception allowing her non-royal descendants to enter the royal enclave, thereby skillfully blending her own lineage with the long-established structure of the state. But on this particular Sunday, two heavily armored Range Rovers finished in the signature jet black reserved for the royal fleet and bearing special emergency license plates strictly designated for activation only in the event of grave constitutional or security threats, suddenly surged through the main royal Crester-Aster gates. They did not slow down to approach the ceremonial entrance, as was customary, when family members were being chauffeured in a leisurely manner. Instead, the vehicles cut sharply and aggressively across the courtyard, immediately veering into a narrow service alley tucked deep behind the stone walls of the private residence. The entire maneuver unfolded in less than 3 minutes of chaos. Outside the secure perimeter, the first indicators of a massive internal crisis began to manifest through the long lenses of seasoned paparazzi who had been monitoring the public boundaries of the estate. Their cameras captured a sequence of events so highly irregular, so completely divorced from standard palace protocol, that it sent an immediate wave of shock through the international press networks. Two heavily armored Range Rovers, painted in the deep black lacquer reserved exclusively for the royal fleet and bearing the specialized, highly restricted emergency palace license plates that are only activated during times of severe constitutional or physical threat, suddenly tore through the main sovereign gates. They did not slow down to approach the grand ceremonial reception entrance, as they always did when family members were being unhurriedly transported. Instead, the vehicles cut a sharp, aggressive path across the courtyard, instantly moving to a tight, obscured service alleyway tucked deep behind the stone walls of the private quarters. The entire transit took less than 3 frantic minutes. The moment the vehicles came to a sudden halt, the true institutional scale of the operation became terrifyingly visible. Royal Protection Command officers and elite special agents from the Sovereign's Guard stepped out of the Range Rovers. Their faces were entirely devoid of emotion, hardened into expressionless masks of absolute state authority, as they immediately deployed to form a human wall, completely blockading the entire length of the private corridor. There was no polite hesitation, no administrative discussion, and no deference shown to the names of those they were about to intercept. What happened next, captured in a series of blurry, high-stakes photographs by the waiting press from the distant perimeter, was the unceremonious expulsion of Queen Camilla's own grandchildren from the sovereign house. Freddie and his siblings were abruptly escorted down the stone steps by the armed guard, moving at a dizzying, suffocating pace that completely bypassed any semblance of dignity or respect. The sheer velocity of the evacuation created a heavy, suffocating atmosphere of intense confusion that quickly spread through every corridor of the castle. The children were not given the opportunity to gather their personal belongings, nor were they allowed the luxury of a slow, protected farewell. The armed guards then thapped and tightly bundled them directly into the rear seats of the emergency vehicles, slammed the reinforced doors shut, and the convoy immediately roared out of the palace gates, leaving behind a trail of burning rubber and an absolute mountain of unanswered questions. To the watching media and the stunned domestic staff standing in the windows above, the message was unmistakable. Something incredibly dangerous, something entirely unprecedented, had just exploded behind the ancient stone walls, and the future king, Prince William, had personally initiated a total security lockdown to purge the liabilities from his house. Inside the palace, the panic had already reached a boiling point long before the tires of the Range Rovers screeched against the pavement. The initial catalyst for the eruption had taken place within the private apartments of Queen Camilla herself. Tom Parker Bowles, executing a deeply ingrained, overly familiar habit that demonstrated just how frequently and casually he had come to treat the sovereign spaces of Windsor over the past decade, had bypassed the master of the household and marched directly into his mother's private sitting room. Tom had arrived under the impression that he was merely handling a routine, domestic family dispute, intending to manipulate his mother's immense institutional influence to fix a growing conflict between him, in his loud, petulant manner behaving like an entitled, complaining boy who believed the crown was a personal shield for his family's social ambitions. Tom began to bitterly complain about Prince William's icy, uncompromising attitude toward his family. He explicitly told Camilla that he was entirely dissatisfied with how the future king was treating his son Freddie and his ex-wife, Sarah Byes, trying to frame the deep constitutional breach as nothing more than a minor misunderstanding based on William's traditional stiffness. But any illusion that this was a manageable domestic squabble vanished instantly when a terrified member of Camilla's inner circle rushed into the sitting room, breathless and pale, bearing an urgent intelligence update directly from the administrative office of the Prince of Wales. The close aide quietly informed the Queen Consort that Prince William had already signed a definitive executive order, and that the armed guards were at that exact moment moving to intercept her grandchildren. The reality of the situation hit Camilla like a physical blow, realizing that her family had crossed a catastrophic line, and that William was executing a calculated, irreversible strike against her bloodline. Camilla's survival instincts instantly overrode her maternal loyalty. Without a single second of hesitation, she aggressively pushed Tom out of her private apartments, ordering him to leave her sight as she scrambled to discover the true depth of the disaster that was about to shatter 20 years of her hard-won royal legitimacy. For exactly 30 agonizing minutes following Tom's abrupt removal from her private sitting room, a heavy, terrifying silence descended upon Queen Camilla's quarters, as the absolute lack of communication from the Prince of Wales's office signaled that a massive institutional execution was underway. The Queen Consort, paralyzed by a mounting sense of dread, I knew that every passing second without an administrative update meant her family's standing was being systematically dismantled behind closed doors. Unable to endure the suffocating isolation any longer, Camilla finally stood up, her hands trembling as she adjusted her royal garments, determined to personally intervene, cross the sovereign threshold, and rescue her grandchildren from the impending administrative purge. She believed that her presence as the crowned queen would force the palace officials to pause, providing her with the necessary leverage to de-escalate the catastrophic confrontation. However, the moment Camilla stepped past the heavy oak threshold of her private apartments and entered the grand gallery, her world completely collapsed. She was not greeted by bowing courtiers or deferential household staff, but was instead brought to a sudden, jarring halt by a literal human wall. Standing rigidly in the center of the historic corridor were senior, high-ranking protection officers from Prince William's personal security detail. Their faces were entirely expressionless, their eyes fixed straight ahead, completely ignoring her royal status as they stood shoulder to shoulder, coldly but effectively blockading the entire length of the hallway. When Camilla attempted to move forward, the lead officer stepped into her path with an unyielding, military precision, calmly but firmly informing her that under the direct, explicit orders of the Prince of Wales, the entire state apartment wing was under an absolute security lockdown, and her access to the private chamber was permanently denied. It was during this exact, deeply humiliating moment of total institutional isolation that the true horror of the situation became audible to the trapped queen consort. Ringing out from behind the thick, reinforced wooden doors of the grand reception room was a high-pitched, piercing female voice that shattered the hushed, sacred silence traditionally required within the sovereign palace. It was Sarah Byes, the ex-wife of Tom and the mother of Freddie, who had completely lost her composure and was now launching into a frantic, unhinged verbal assault against the future king. Sarah was screaming at the top of her lungs, unleashing a torrent of vulgar insults, irrational justifications, and wild accusations directly at Prince William. Completely unhinged by the reality of her son's imminent expulsion, she loudly accused the Prince of Wales of being an unyielding, cruel dictator, fiercely claiming that he was running a tyrannical regime within the palace and abusing his immense sovereign power to intentionally target her innocent children. Listening to the thuggish, deeply ignorant rants of her daughter-in-law echoing through the historic hallway, Queen Camilla felt a profound, suffocating sense of total soup dough. In that single, devastating moment, she realized that the only real weapon she had ever possessed, the meticulous social concao, the quiet patience, and the flawless diplomatic restraint she had carefully practiced for over 20 years to secure her legitimacy, had been completely pulverized by the staggering arrogance and uneducated vulgarity of her own family. She stood entirely frozen as Sarah's screaming arguments grew increasingly desperate, foolishly attempting to defend Freddie's severe security violations and his malicious insults against the Princess of Wales by launching a chaotic, disrespectful attack on the character of the future king himself. Facing the glacial, unwavering authority of Prince William's blockade on one side and the screeching, theatrical madness of Sarabai's on the other, Camilla was seized by the terrifying realization that any attempt to intervene would be an act of absolute political suicide. Her legs grew incredibly weak, and her entire body began to shake, with a mixture of intense shame and absolute powerlessness. She knew that by allowing her family to treat the royal household with such casual disrespect, she had enabled the very monster that was now destroying her life's work. Without uttering a single word of defense, without making a single attempt to salvage the wreckage of her family's reputation, the Queen of the United Kingdom slowly faltered, turned her back on the screaming voices of her children, and walked back into her dark, empty apartments in a state of complete pathetic defeat, leaving the Parker Bowles faction to face the ruthless, unyielding justice of the sovereign future alone. The catastrophic fallout from the Sunday lockdown did not dissipate with the departure of the emergency convoy, but instead hardened into a permanent, icy reality that forced Queen Camilla into a position of unprecedented subservience. For exactly 24 hours following the public expulsion of her grandchildren, the Queen Consort remained entirely sequestered within her private quarters, receiving absolutely no communication, no formal administrative reports, and no personal reassurances from either the King or the Prince of Wales. The utter silence from the sovereign offices was a calculated psychological weapon, deliberately designed to emphasize her total isolation and to signal that her crown possessed absolutely no leverage within the changing power structures of the court. Realizing that her entire life's work was on the verge of being completely erased by the lingering stench of her family's vulgarity, Camilla was forced to take an action that she had spent decades trying to avoid. She had to personally walk to Prince William's administrative headquarters and beg for an audience. The following morning, the deep shift in the palace hierarchy became visible to every courtier and household official witnessing the Queen Consort's approach to the Prince of Wales's executive wing. Camilla did not arrive with the grand, confident stride of a reigning monarch surrounded by a deferential entourage. Instead, she walked through the historic stone corridors with a heavily strained, deeply hesitant demeanor, her movements characterized by an unmistakable aura of profound embarrassment and extreme caution. When she reached the outer reception area of William's private office, she was not immediately ushered through the doors with the immediate deference traditionally accorded to the wife of the king. Instead, the Prince of Wales's senior private secretary coldly informed her that His Royal Highness was currently engaged in a high-level, confidential state meeting, and that she would be required to wait until the current schedule was fully completed. For more than one agonizing hour, the Queen of the United Kingdom was forced to sit entirely alone in the sterile, unyielding atmosphere of the executive waiting room, subjected to the silent scrutiny of junior clerks and passing aides. Behind the thick oak doors, Prince William was deliberately conducting an extended, highly strategic conference with Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh, and Senior Military Commander Thompson, methodically reviewing the future restructuring of the royal estates and the permanent enforcement of the new security boundaries. William was intentionally letting the clock run, ensuring that Camilla fully absorbed the reality of her new, diminished standing before he granted her a single second of his time. Every tick of the palace clock in that waiting room was a brutal reminder that her decades of hard-won influence had been completely neutralized by the reckless, thuggish behavior of her daughter-in-law. When the heavy doors finally opened and Camilla was permitted to enter the private office, the contrast between her historical ambition and her current vulnerability was devastating. The Prince of Wales did not stand up to greet her with familial warmth, nor did he offer any diplomatic pleasantries to ease the suffocating tension in the room. He remained seated behind his large desk, his expression a mask of unyielding, glacial composure that remained completely unchanged before, during, and after the entire interaction. Camilla approached the desk with a remarkably submissive, hyper-formal, and visibly uncomfortable posture, her voice dropping to a low, hesitant whisper as she gingerly introduced the subject of her daughter-in-law and her grandchildren. She did not possess the courage to voice a single demand, nor did she dare to request a single act of royal clemency or a reversal of the permanent security ban. This highly anticipated meeting was not a negotiation. It was a total, unconditional surrender by the crowned Queen of England before the unstoppable force of the future reign. Standing before the unyielding wall of Prince William's silence, Queen Camilla was forced to execute the most painful and calculated humiliation of her entire institutional life. She knew that any attempt to utilize her official position as the crowned queen consort would backfire disastrously against the absolute, concrete power held by the heir to the throne. Therefore, instead of seeking to minimize the catastrophic actions of her family or defend the unhinged behavior that had shattered the peace of the castle on Sunday, Camilla chose to completely dismantle her own family line in a desperate attempt to salvage her remaining personal standing. In a voice that was completely devoid of its usual authority, she began to deliberately and methodically highlight the non-aristocratic, civilian origins of her children and grandchildren, presenting them as individuals who were fundamentally incapable of understanding the sacred traditions and rigid boundaries of the court. With an intentional, highly strategic display of submissiveness, Camilla explicitly emphasized that the members of the Parker Bowles family were, at their core, merely ordinary commoners who lacked the generational education, the polished discipline, and the deep comprehension of court etiquette required to exist within the sovereign enclosure. She practically laid the entire blame for the crisis upon the shoulders of her family's background, arguing to the Prince of Wales that their shocking lack of respect and vulgar outbursts were the direct result of their civilian ignorance rather than an intentional act of malice against the crown. By deliberately lowering the status of her own flesh and blood before the future king, Camilla was sacrificing the dignity of her children to plead for a single shred of sovereign understanding, hoping that William would look down upon their stupidity with disdain, rather than punishing them as a legitimate political threat to his future reign. The most shocking element of this private audience was Camilla's total, unconditional surrender on behalf of her daughter-in-law, Sarah Byes. She did not offer a single justification for the screeching, disrespectful insults that Sarah had hurled through the palace corridors during the Sunday lockdown. Instead, Camilla openly validated Prince William's anger, explicitly stating to him that she found the behavior of her daughter-in-law to be utterly foolish, uneducated, and entirely indefensible. The queen consort was effectively kneeling before the administrative desk of the future sovereign, formally presenting a deep, groveling apology for the severe psychological distress and security violations her family had brought into the House of Windsor. She made it entirely clear that she was not there to ask for favors, nor did she expect William to lift the permanent exile he had implemented. Her sole purpose was to distance herself entirely from the wreckage of the Parker Bowles faction, and to assure the heir that her own loyalty to the institution remained entirely separate from the liabilities of her private bloodline. This unprecedented display of weakness marked the total collapse of the independent persona that Camilla had spent decades attempting to project within the royal household. For years, she had relied on the unwavering affection and personal indulgence of King Charles to carve out a secure, highly protected space where her civilian family could enjoy the warmth of royal privilege without ever paying the price of public duty. She had achieved grand titles, official recognitions, and a seat of immense honor at the right hand of the monarch, leading many within the court to believe that her influence was permanent and untouchable. But as she stood before William, stripped of all diplomatic armor and forced to beg for an understanding based on the sheer stupidity of her children, the illusion of her power vanished completely. She was fully aware that William was looking through her theatrical humility with a cold, mathematical precision, recognizing that her sudden submission was driven entirely by a desperate panic to protect her own long-term survival within the state. The deep psychological horror that gripped Queen Camilla during her agonizing audience with the Prince of Wales did not stem merely from the immediate humiliation of the Sunday lockdown or the vulgar shouting of her daughter-in-law. The true, devastating core of her panic lay in the complete, systematic destruction of a specific sovereign privilege that she had spent more than 20 arduous years attempting to secure from King Charles III. For decades, the queen consort had meticulously utilized her private influence over her husband to gradually carve out an extraordinary administrative exception, the official right to regularly introduce her civilian children and grandchildren into the highly restricted, sacred spaces of the royal palaces. It was an unprecedented arrangement that allowed the Parker Bowles bloodline to regularly pass through the sovereign gates, a victory that Camilla viewed as the ultimate, definitive proof that her private family had been successfully integrated into the ancient fabric of the British monarchy. By forcing her to wait for over an hour, and then receiving her apology with a frozen, unwavering silence, Prince William was intentionally signaling that this hard-won domestic arrangement was now permanently dead. The bi-monthly Sunday visits, which had been a consistent, highly synchronized feature of palace life, were completely erased from the operational schedule of the Windsor estate by a single executive order from the future king. This calculated cancellation meant that Camilla's family was effectively stripped of their unique status as accepted insiders and thrust back out into the cold reality of ordinary civilian life. Although King Charles had previously granted his personal permission for these gatherings to occur within the palace walls, William's lightning-fast security intervention on Sunday proved to everyone within the court that the sovereign future belonged entirely to the heir, and that the king's personal indulgences would no longer be permitted to compromise the safety and dignity of the state. The loss of this royal access effectively pushed Camilla's private life entirely out of its carefully constructed orbit, completely undoing the delicate domestic balance she had spent a lifetime trying to maintain. While it was true that she still possessed her private country residence at Ray Mill House, where she could technically meet with her children and grandchildren away from the prying eyes of the international press, that civilian property existed entirely outside the prestigious aura of the royal court. Meeting her family at a private country house was an explicit admission of institutional defeat. It removed them from the grand, protective shield of the palace, security apparatus, and permanently disconnected them from the daily life of the reigning family. For decades, Camilla had worked tirelessly to ensure that her grandchildren would grow up with the immense social prestige of being regular, accepted guests within the royal household. Believing that this proximity would guarantee their long-term social standing and elevation within British high society. Now, that grand ambition lay in absolute ruins, completely shattered by the staggering ignorance of Tom and the unhinged behavior of Sarah Byes during the Sunday lockdown. Camilla was fully aware that by allowing her family to treat the sovereign spaces of Windsor with such casual disrespect, she had effectively handed Prince William the perfect institutional weapon to permanently excise her bloodline from the future reign. As she prepared to leave the private office, her heart sinking into a state of total, unadulterated defeat, she looked across the desk at the Prince of Wales, desperately searching for a single indicator of human softness or a potential path toward future reconciliation. But there was absolutely no mercy to be found within the glacial composure of the future sovereign. William remained entirely unmoved, his face a chilling mask of state finality that made it undeniably clear that the permanent exile of the Parker Bowles family was non-negotiable and that the ancient crown would never again tolerate the liabilities of her private line. The heavy oak door of Prince William's private office clicked shut with a low, definitive thud that signaled the absolute conclusion of Queen Camilla's institutional trial. Walking out into the long, vaulted gallery of the Windsor estate, the Queen Consort was a completely transformed figure, entirely stripped of the fierce, calculated confidence that had defined her long, arduous journey to the right hand of the king. She moved down the corridor with a slow, heavy step, her eyes fixed firmly on the ancient stone floor as she fully absorbed the reality of her total defeat. There were no senior courtiers rushing to her side to offer comfort. No private secretaries waiting to help her manage the public relations fallout, and no diplomatic avenues left to explore. The silence that filled the palace was total, a cold and suffocating vacuum that marked the permanent erasure of her family's unearned influence within the sovereign house. Behind her, remaining seated at his grand administrative desk, the Prince of Wales did not alter his position or show a single flicker of emotion as her footsteps faded into the distance. His expression remained exactly as it had been before she entered. An unyielding, glacial mask of sovereign finality that prioritized the long-term protection of the crown above all else. For William, this had never been a mere family squabble or a temporary boundary dispute with his stepmother. It was a cold, mathematical execution of state duty, a vital defensive strike designed to permanently neutralize a toxic nest of entitlement before it could inflict further damage upon the character of the Princess of Wales or compromise the structural security of the monarchy itself. The future king had made his decision, and the absolute lack of hesitation in his delivery sent a terrifying message to every corner of the court. As the days began to pass following that historic Monday audience, Queen Camilla found herself trapped in a state of agonizing anticipation, quietly waiting for the next phase of the administrative execution to land upon her household. She knew with absolute certainty that the signed executive orders from William's office would slowly but surely ripple through every branch of the palace bureaucracy, systematically dismantling the numerous exceptions and privileges she had spent decades quietly extracting from King Charles. The bi-monthly Sunday gatherings were already permanently gone, but the wider freeze-out was destined to be much more severe. Every official guest registry for the upcoming year, every secure family communication network, and every private invitation to the seasonal royal estates was being methodically purged of the Parker Bowles name, ensuring that her children and grandchildren would become total strangers to the daily life of the court. The true tragedy of Camilla's position was the realization that she was entirely powerless to stop the unfolding destruction of her life's work. She had compromised her own dignity, lowered the status of her own bloodline, and publicly labeled her family as ignorant commoners in a desperate bid to secure William's sympathy, yet her performance had failed to move the future sovereign a single inch. The decades she had spent carefully balancing her private maternal desires with the rigid demands of the crown had been completely undone, in less than an hour, by the unhinged shouting of Sarah Byes and the petulant entitlement of Tom. Her family had mistaken royal hospitality for absolute entitlement, and that single, arrogant miscalculation had provided the Prince of Wales with the perfect institutional weapon to permanently lock them out of the future reign. As the sun began to set over the ancient stone battlements of Windsor Castle, casting long, dark shadows across the quadrangle where the emergency convoy had sat just days before, the new reality of the British monarchy became undeniably clear to all who served within its walls. The era of comfortable exceptions, private indulgences, and peripheral relatives exploiting the prestige of the throne for personal clout was officially over. The sovereign future belonged exclusively to those who protected the integrity of the line with unwavering loyalty and silent duty. Queen Camilla remained secluded in her quiet, darkening apartments, forced to sit amid the ruins of her grand ambition and listen to the absolute silence of a palace that had already moved on without her family, leaving her to face the cold, unyielding dawn of a new reign alone.